There probably isn't a hardcore anime fan out there that hasn't at least thought about living in Japan. And as much as we like to laugh at the likes of Ken-sama, or mock the filthy weeaboos who proclaim that glorious Nippon is the coolest and you baka gaijin just don't understand, deep down, I think every anime fan secretly wonders what it would be like to walk among the rice fields amidst the crying cicadas, to drink until dawn with their friends at an izakaya, or to put on a yukata and walk around a summer festival with their friends at night. So if lots of people have fantasized about moving to Japan, why is it that not many actually have? A question that's made even more interesting because moving to Japan actually isn't all that hard. There is one surefire way to move and live and work in Japan, and that's the route that I took: teaching English. If it's unclear to anyone that hasn't looked at my Twitter feed, I used to live in Japan because I went there to teach English. I spent 2 years in the city of Sendai, and it was a wonderful experience. But recently I left, and it was my own choice to do so. But why? Why would someone who has been invested in video games and anime and Japanese culture since grade school willingly leave Japan, the greatest country on earth? Well, dear viewer, allow me to tell you why a weeb would leave Japan. Excuse the blog posting, but I feel like some of this might be relevant or interesting to those that are fans of anime or Japanese culture. And it also serves as a reason why I haven't posted a video in like 9 months. It began with taking care of all of the paperwork involved in emigrating from a country where every document is written in Japanese, and also a country where the dates I wrote on all of those documents are for a year that no longer exists. And then after I returned to the US, I started a new job, I started a master's program, I got my first nephew, and I've been trying to coordinate potentially moving to a different state in another 6 months. I haven't had a ton of time, so the channel has kind of gone on the back burner. But now I want to get back to creating content. I really enjoy making videos for this channel, and it's a much better hobby than becoming an alcoholic. Which isn't really a hobby, I guess. Before I start, a quick disclaimer. This is all anecdotal and completely based on my own experiences and the experiences of those I've talked to. It may not be applicable to the whole of Japan. I recognize that there are important factors that went into my personal desire to leave. While I learned the language well enough to have conversations, and I learned the meanings of over 2,000 kanji, although not all of their readings, I was far from being able to pass either of the top 2 level proficiency tests in Japanese. This limited my ability to switch into a more solid career path within Japan. I also didn't have a lot of Japanese friends. I had 2 or 3, but thanks to living close to Tohoku University, a lot of my friends were people that were university students or expats, which caused most of my off-time interactions, even with Japanese people, to be done in English. There were also personal circumstances, like wanting to go back and be closer to my family, which contributed to my overall decision to leave. So with that out of the way, what are the more ubiquitous reasons I decided to leave? The first thing to consider for anyone thinking of moving to Japan who is an anime fan and gets most of their understanding of how Japan works from said anime, a good starting point to go from is that you probably think anime is more important to the Japanese than it really is. If you expect to move to Japan and talk with anyone and everyone about your favorite episode of FLCL, or how much you like One Punch Man, or whether KyoAni really is the best studio, you'll probably be sadly disappointed. Anime as a hobby in Japan, just as in the West, is not a common one to have. And in fact, most of the anime hobbyists in Japan are not the kind of people you would usually meet in a social situation. You want to know what kinds of answers I got when I would ask my students what their favorite anime was? SpongeBob, Star vs. Evil, Gravity Falls. Anime is just short for animation, and a lot of Japanese people see less of a divide between animated shows coming from Japan and coming from elsewhere. To put things simply, the Japanese people in general have pretty entry-level tastes. Sure, any person you just grab off the street is probably going to be more knowledgeable about anime and manga than the average Westerner, particularly for what was larger at the time they were growing up. You would have a hard time finding a Japanese person that doesn't have at least some familiarity with Dragon Ball or One Piece. And Doraemon and Shin-chan are childhood icons used on literally everything. I've run into older people at bars and they've expressed love for older series. I even got a guy in his 70s to sing the theme from Space Battleship Yamato at karaoke once. It's very difficult to find fellow fans of series that aren't massive pillars of the industry. If we're talking about currently airing anime in Japan, you're still not likely to find anyone older than high school to talk to about it. Interestingly, most of the conversations I've had about anime in Japan with adults have been about JoJo. That could have been because I was living in Araki's home city and the basis for Morio, but JoJo is practically an institution and seemingly everyone in Japan is familiar with it on some level. Anime merch is another thing you're not likely to see outside of teenagers' book bags. Things like cell phone straps and keychains are fairly common. I have seen a decent number of people wearing anime-related clothing, probably more than I would expect to see in the US. But I never saw much of the niche stuff outside of one time where a guy was wearing a sweater from a Kizuna Ai live show. East or West, loving anime as much as you or I do is still a niche hobby, no matter where you go. And just like the West, the serious otakus of Japan are people you would most likely not meet outside of their native habitat. So the draw of being out and proud of your fandom is stifled a bit. But there's still plenty to like in Japan, right? What other things would cause someone to want to leave? The second main reason I chose to leave Japan was money. I'd say more than half of the foreigners I met in Japan started there as English teachers, mainly through the ALT or Assistant Language Teaching system. The others came as students at Japanese universities, often for only a semester or two. Even those I knew who weren't teachers got their start teaching English before moving on to another job. This is how I made my way to Japan. While teaching in Japanese junior and senior high schools was an immensely rewarding experience, I made very little money. A fun part of being an ALT in Japan, and being a teacher in general depending on the system, is that you don't get paid in full, or sometimes at all, during school breaks. Plus, taxes in Japan are not cheap, especially after your first year when you have to start paying the citizen tax and you have a reduced exemption on the national pension program. Most ALTs make up for this by taking a second job. This eliminates a lot of the draw of being in Japan. Traveling in Japan can be expensive. Bullet trains usually cost as much, if not more, than a plane ticket, and hotel costs add up. You can try to mitigate this with budget airlines and capsule hotels, but that only helps so much. Saving money as an ALT in Japan is a difficult process. All it takes is one trip to Tokyo or some merch you bought at a pop-up shop to shave away your already thin monthly budget. My options were to either get a second job or do less fun stuff and continue being the lazy motherfucker that I am. I chose the second option. I did have a lot of fun in Japan, and I saw a lot of amazing stuff. But living somewhere means that you can't be a full-time tourist, as exciting as your new home might be. Is this a problem for everyone? Of course not. One of my best friends was a member of the US military and stationed in Tokyo. He made more than enough money to travel around Japan, going to Crush 40 concerts, and buying all the Monster Hunter merch he could fit in his apartment. What I'm saying is that the most common way Western weebs would come and live in Japan long term is not one that's particularly convenient for actually experiencing Japan. So it's sounding like you'll have to find something other than anime to obsess over, and you'll have to explore your local area instead of traveling around a lot. That doesn't sound like a deal breaker, and that's true. For some it might not be, but the next issue is a deeper one, and it's not as easy to escape as finding compatriots or getting the right job. The societal norms of Japan are different from anywhere in the West. Japan is far more traditionalist than Western countries, and it's very collectivist. The needs of society are put before the needs of the individual, and individuals see themselves as having a duty to fill the role that society has given them. This also means that they expect others to fill their societal role. At best, this takes the form of cooperation and social cohesion. At worst, it leads to conflict with people that don't fit the mold. Japanese people are very passive-aggressive when it comes to dealing with others, and they often won't tell someone when they have an issue. One popular tactic I've seen used is to ask someone the same question over and over and over again until it's clear that it's not a question but an instruction. Like asking a woman in a revealing top if she's cold and needs to put on a jacket, or asking if you're really sure that you're not coming to the work party tonight for the 10th time. This can also be done by listening to someone else's point of view and then completely ignoring them and forcing the proper way to do things. I've seen this one a lot in couples where the husband is Japanese and the wife is from a different country. It's expected in Japan that if a couple gets married, the wife quits her job and takes care of the home while raising children. Obviously, women from the United States and Europe don't usually subscribe to this mentality. This can often cause conflict. One woman I played D&D with in Japan had to bring her 2-year-old daughter to sessions every week because her husband refused to take care of her, even on nights when he was off work. The same woman had the private English school she worked at not extend her contract after multiple years of working with them, for reasons that were never explained to her. She told me she thought it was because she needed special provisions, like leaving early or taking certain days off because of her daughter, and she was under the impression that her employers disapproved of this. A lot of women in Japan don't get married specifically because they want to focus on their careers. I've had some of my Japanese friends tell me that they aren't looking to get married because they don't want to have to quit their job. I've had others tell me they have to make themselves look ugly when they go to a job interview because Japanese companies don't want to hire beautiful women because they think they're more likely to get married and then quit. While it may not be spoken out loud, Japan has an idea of how women should be, and it finds a way to put them into that framework, despite the efforts of younger generations to resist. Foreigners tend to be exempt from societal norms in Japan. Things get excused because it's sort of accepted that you just don't know any better. But that goes away as you get to know people, and the longer you maintain relationships, the more that initial understanding becomes confusion as to why you haven't learned to fit in yet. Learning not to stick your chopsticks straight up in rice or not to call people anata is one thing, but there's a lot more to culture than that. Plus, you're not only learning to function within a new culture, you're also starting to forget your own. After living in Japan for 2 years, I strongly believe that all people should spend at least 1 year living abroad, not only to experience a new culture, but to better appreciate your own. It's sort of a you don't know what you've got till it's gone situation. I never realized how many parts of life were specifically related to being an American until I was no longer living in America interacting with other Americans. I gained a new appreciation for my home country and a new sense of identity. It really puts things into context and gives you a new framework to operate from, which I think is helpful for people that both like or dislike their own country. A big part of living in Japan wasn't just appreciating the great ideas the Japanese had to improve their daily lives. It was also missing the conveniences and culture of the United States. People like to use the word culture shock when they talk about things like this, and I'm not really a fan of that term. I often got asked by people if I experienced culture shock when I moved to Japan, and I always told them no, because there was no real shock. The way I saw it, I had been studying to live in Japan since I was 10 years old. Things like showering before you get into the bathtub or taking your shoes off inside of certain buildings is entry-level stuff for a watcher of anime. But culture shock isn't really a shock, at least not in my experience. It's more of a slow, creeping dread. It sets in over time. It's a feeling that things are different, abnormal, and they won't go back to how they were, ever. It's like looking at a crooked painting. And it's often in ways that you can't describe or put your finger on. Culture shock for me was often in the form of feeling very out of phase with everything. It creeps in when you're meeting new people, and you get the feeling that they're just smiling and nodding with no clue what you're talking about, or when you're doing the same to them. It grabs you when you can't bring yourself to leave home to get food, because you don't want to take the time to learn your way through another menu and you've been to the regular places a dozen times this week. It digs at you when all you want is a fucking pulled pork sandwich, and the only place you know that has one is 2 hours away by bullet train and requires reservations 24 hours in advance. You end up feeling like things aren't normal. It feels like everything you do takes a little extra effort to cross some barrier. It doesn't always feel that way. Some days are fine, and some are crushing, but it does get better over time. The more that you learn the language, the more you integrate with the culture. But in my 2-year experience, it never goes away. And that's easily the biggest problem. You will never be Japanese. It's a fact that you cannot change. Unless you were born racially Japanese, it's not gonna happen. When I first arrived in Japan, I stayed in Tokyo for a week before heading up north for training. While I was in Tokyo staying with a friend, I did a lot of fun things. One of which was going to a wonderful place called Oedo Onsen Monogatari. It's on Odaiba, an artificial island in Tokyo Bay, and it's basically an artificial hot spring with a summer festival theme. It's got goldfish scooping and prize shooting and masks you can wear on the side of your head. Plus it's full of festival food and everyone gets to wear yukata. It's pretty great. So while I was at this hot spring, I decided to sit in the sauna for a while with my friend. We were in there a few minutes before a white guy walked in. He looked to be somewhere in his 50s, and not long after he sat down, he struck up a conversation with us. He asked us how long we'd been in Japan and why we were there, etc. We asked him the same, and he told us that he had been living in Japan for nearly 30 years. He told us how much he loved the culture of Japan, how much he loved living there, and how he planned to live there for the rest of his life. But he told us about a different side of it. He told us about how he worked on a TV show, and how his job was basically to be the dumb foreigner on the show who doesn't understand Japanese culture, despite the opposite being true in real life. He talked about how he still has people asking him how long he's been in Japan, and when he tells them 30 years, they still ask him how much longer he's planning on staying. He even said he has neighbors he's known for years that still ask him that question. He told us about his 2 sons who are half Japanese, but who are treated differently than the other kids at their high school. They're treated as foreigners despite being born and raised in Japan and never knowing anywhere else. He told us the truth. You can move to Japan, you can adopt the culture, you can learn the language, you can spend your whole life there, you can die there, but you will never be Japanese. I didn't move to Japan to become Japanese. I didn't expect to go full expat, and I didn't expect to spend the rest of my life there. But this still caused an issue for me. Japan has something called omotenashi. It translates roughly to hospitality. It's the idea that you do everything for your guest and put all of their needs above your own. And this idea extends to guests in your country. Most places you go in Japan will be friendly and go out of their way to help you. My first day of training, I had trouble finding my hotel. And a nice high school student not only helped me find it, but he also carried one of my bags. It's a nice aspect, but eventually it only serves you to remind you that you are a guest, an outsider. This compounds with the fact that Japanese people are not particularly open with how they feel. My Japanese friends are some of the friendliest, funniest, and most positive people I've ever met. They buy people drinks, ask them how they are, and tell them how good they look. But it's always very focused on you, not them. It's difficult to get Japanese people to talk about themselves. They're usually very self-effacing and avoid talking about themselves because culturally it's seen as boastful. This made it really difficult to get any kind of deeper connection and turn acquaintances into close friends. I actually started seeking out foreigners to become friends with by the end of my time in Japan. There was a noticeable difference in the amount of effort each interaction took between my Japanese friends and my American ones. And a friendship where every interaction requires more effort is much harder to maintain. The feeling of always being a guest, an outsider, made living in Japan feel almost like purgatory. I was enjoying myself, but I knew it was just me waiting until I had to leave. I knew it was temporary. that I would always be just visiting. By the end of my time in Japan, I was happy to be returning to America. I liked my coworkers, I had friends, and there was still a lot of Japan left for me to see. I was somewhat sad to be leaving. My farewells to each of my teachers and classes were very emotional, and the few Japanese friends I had gave me a big send-off. But I've been back in the States for over a month now, and I feel a lot better than I did before. Now I want to end this video with something positive. Yes, standing out and feeling like you're a curiosity piece to be explored can feel isolating, but it also makes you feel a bit like a celebrity. Not everyone in Japan will talk to you about anime, but you do have some of the best opportunities to experience anime that you can't get anywhere else. There are positive aspects to living in Japan, and I plan on exploring some of them in another video, but I wanted to lead with this one as a bit of catharsis for myself. Since I've been back, I've had to explain this probably over 100 times to my family and friends who want to know why I decided to leave Japan. And I've tried my best to make this the most informative version of that I could. This is all anecdotal and specific to my experience. I worked and made friends with people who had spent 10 years in Japan. People that had families there, that never planned to leave. We would sometimes bond over our complaints about Japan and how it operated. I'm looking at you, hospitals and clinics that close at 4 p.m. and aren't open on weekends. But there are plenty of people out there that roll with these problems and choose to stay. One of my favorite YouTube channels, and the one that inspired me to move to Japan in the first place, is dedicated to how great living abroad in Japan is. My main hope for this video is not to dissuade people from moving to Japan. It's more to inform and hopefully make anyone considering it more aware about what they're getting into. I still tell everyone I know that Japan is a wonderful place to visit, and everyone should go at least once in their life. But in my experience living there, 2 years was enough.